in mobilizing ideas of origin centered on central to articulation of diaspora to attract international resources from people of African descent for communities, for community, national, and continental development. Okay. So non-governmental organizations, IGOs, and most national governments on the continent have established programs or agencies in order to capitalize on diaspora's contribution. So when maybe 15 years ago, there were about 10 different African countries that had some sort of diaspora office. Today, almost 50 of the 55 African countries have either a diaspora office or a ministry or some agency within the government to engage diaspora. Despite billions of dollars of transfer from the diaspora flowing to the continent, major indicators suggest that there is no substantial transformational benefits for the continent of such transfers. Hence, this paper explored the possibility of reformulating understanding of diaspora that will inform institutional apparatuses organized for sharing, mobilizing the social, political, and economic resources in support of project of what seems to be elusive development on the continent. So I will start first by exploring conceptualize of diaspora that I'm working with, but I'll first give some context. So diasporic framework were created by Global Africa, and this include not only African born, but those also born in the diaspora. When we speak of Equiano, Wilbert Blyden, these individuals talk about ideas of the African diaspora, even though themselves didn't use the exact word of the African diaspora. And in the 20th century, we have individuals like W. Du Bois, Mary Bethune, McLeod Bethune, and Amy Jack Garvey were some of the people who used the diasporic framing, even though they didn't use the word necessarily diaspora. So it was in the 1950s we started having a clearer conceptualization of what it is, what the African diaspora is. And one of the pioneering scholars was Joseph Harris, who defined the diaspora. And then you have other scholars coming along later, like Kim Butler, Heinz Hall, and different people, Zaleza, that came to clearly presenting a detailed description of what is the African diaspora. So I don't have enough time to go into detail in terms of these definitions in this presentation, but I wanted to add that in conceptualizing diaspora, they all engage the issue of the circumstance of people, regarded to be outside of their homeland and deemed to be of African origin to foster a type of unity, have to confront some various form of oppression, is usually tied to whatever definition of diaspora is used by these earlier scholars in terms of the diasporic framework, going centuries back, and from since the post-1950s, 60s, they use similar conceptualizations. But when we also look at diaspora, we also want to look at not what it is, but how it works, not in the literal sense, but also as a critical practice. And so I argue that the idea of collective consciousness, idea of common African origins, and the challenge to Black objection, which is also all attempts to deny people of African descent real humanity as a part of the earlier conceptualization of diaspora. African diaspora is constituted, I argue, with these three different elements. And in this, you have African diaspora and its politics is engaged in a quest for dignity, equality, justice, and rights for African and people of African descent. So the politics of diaspora is about the struggle of recognizing the full humanity of African people. in many ways. So okay. So in going further, um, in going forward, I'm going to look at the African Union and the African diaspora. And I am arguing also that centuries of global Africans diasporic framing should also be used in the African Union definition of the diaspora. So for the African Union, according to the African Union, definition of the African diaspora, peoples of African origin living outside the continent, irrespective of their citizenship and nationality, who are willing to contribute to the development of the continent and the building of the African Union. And I agree with the African Union in terms of the idea of people of African descent is important, but I think the two other important element that has been conceptualized by earlier scholars should incorporate the idea of collective consciousness and should also incorporate the idea of challenging Black objection in their definition of the diaspora. So in going further in terms of engaging development, in this understanding, Africa engaging the working of the African diaspora has an effective means of uniting with African descendants in the promotion of global African transformation, as in development or post-development. So in working on this paper, I'm still trying to figure out whether I should use the word development or post-development. So the issue is that the idea of development as it is used is often associated with the very Western idea of what development is. And I'm either interested in looking at alternative to development, or alternative to the popular idea of development, or going along with scholars that speak about post-development, which is the idea of going on beyond development and thinking development projects are not workable at all. And so we should basically go beyond it or move beyond it. I'm trying to decide the direction I should go. But I do agree with many scholars and their critique of development, the popular idea of development that is used by the West. And this popular idea of development is unsustainable and it's unobtainable. The West have actually argued that the method of development that we are using is unsustainable. And the current trajectory that we are on, it will lead to global destruction of humanity. That's why we have all of these conferences about global warming, global change, and we have conferences on ideas about changing, like the United States in the world. We would need 5 planets to do that because the amount of resources that the United States use in terms of the amount of sources we have on the planet, it's not sustainable for humanity to continue such a process of development. Okay, so when we talk about transformation and development and post-development, like so many scholars have argued that the continent has no shortages of idea of what development look like or what post-development look like. And these have come in many different forms, from Pan-Africanism to Ethiopianism, nigger to the African Renaissance. And you have different declarations, plans of actions, and different organizations that support these different ideas of what Africans consider as development. But however, because of time, I am also focusing on one particular method of particular idea of African development. This is looking at AU Agenda 2063. So the agenda was created through an extensive consultation process from various local, national, and regional stakeholders interrogating African transformation. So in many ways, this document identifies the top priorities on the continent in terms of what it is to be developed or what it is to go beyond development and to have a prosperous, peaceful Africa. And so according to the Agenda 2063, We are confident that Africa has the capacity to realize our full potential in development, culture, peace, and to establish flourishing, inclusive, prosperous society. So within Agenda 2063 is the idea of Africa that we want, and it has mainly 7 aspirations. So within these 7 aspirations are also, I believe, is also could be linked to a new conceptualization of diaspora, where we use it as a method of improving the conditions of Africans and African descendants. So the 3 elements of diaspora that I spoke of earlier links with the 7 aspirations of the 7 aspirations of the African Union Agenda 2063. So the idea of common African origins, an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values is supported within that number 5 in terms of aspiration. Then when we look at collective consciousness, aspiration 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 connects with that particular aspiration. So within aspiration 2, we also have the idea of an integrated continent, politically united, based on the ideas of Pan-Africanism and the vision of African Renaissance. So the best way to get this done is actually through collective consciousness. In the paper, I elaborate more on ideas of consciousness in terms of collective consciousness that relates to education and relates to language. But because of the limited time for the presentation, I'm not able to get into it. So maybe we will be able to talk about it more maybe in the discussion section. And then challenging black objection. Point number 7 is related to this in terms of having Africa as a strong, united, and influential global player and partner. So with this, I think that is very important for Africa to challenge marginalization that the continent have faced since the transatlantic slave trade and since the experience of European colonialism. So in the global system today, Africa is seen as the place of underdevelopment, place of high illiteracy, place of uncivilized and poverty-stricken. This is a perception that is throughout the world, but it's a perception, it's just a perception, it's actually not a reality of what is on the African continent. But that global perception has an impact on African position in the world. And so in seeking these aspirations, one of the things I also talk about is also reparation and justice on the global scale. So I also could talk more about this in terms of question and answer. And I would conclude by basically saying Africa with these 7 aspirations of AU Agenda 2063 may engage not only the specific element and component of diaspora, but also looking at the overall politics of diaspora. So this is a means for global Africa to realize what Horace Campbell referred to as a space of emancipated people. So the call for African transformation means to go to the root of underdevelopment. And so to go to the root of underdevelopment, there are some fundamental things that has to be addressed. And the diaspora could play a role in terms of moving Africa forward in terms of transformation. And so with this, I will end my presentation. Thank you.